Rachel Wexler, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
We're excited to talk about all things reproductive technology and the law.
I was in law school, and kind of like, a lot of people who go to law school, wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do something in family law, but I really was drawn to things that, to the reproductive area. And I took a seminar in law school called Sexuality in the Law. And I went to law school in Michigan, which until very recently was one of the states that had sort of a very old surrogacy ban on the books. Yeah. And I knew nothing about surrogacy as a law student. I didn't even know that that was even really something that there would be law about. Yeah. And we learned about it in this class, and it was just shocking to me. It was fascinating. And I just kind of went from there and realized that there was this whole area of law where you could help people have families. It was happy. Most of the areas of laws that, people were coming into law school to talk to us about were depressing, right? Yeah. So in family law, you could go into divorce, you could do custody. Yep. You could do the other side of parental rights, like termination of parental rights. Yeah. But this was just fascinating to me. And it was also the other side of reproductive rights. It was not abortion, which was, incredibly interesting to me and important. But it was just a whole new area. And especially being in law school, as someone who had worked for 4 years, as someone who was, making friends with other women who had worked between college and law school, who were worried about the biological clock. This was something that was on everyone's mind, yeah. Especially since we were about to go into a field that demands a lot of you, and, where your reproductive clock might be different than, what was traditional. So that's kind of how I got started thinking about it. And then, just like anyone else, I kind of pounded the pavement and reached out to lots of people in this field, and worked my way in, which still feels like a miracle to me.
This entire area of law has changed so much. I know since I was in law school. I remember taking a class in law school similar to what you were describing. And the professor just kind of stood there and asked a lot of hypothetical questions. And students gave the best answers that they could. And he said, this is the Wild West. There really is no case law. There really are no statutes. So what do you think should happen? And so my question for you is, how has the law in this area evolved over the past 10 years or so?
It's evolved a lot. I mean, it's evolved so much since I've been in law school, and so much even since I've been in this field. A lot more laws have been made, which is a good thing. It's a good thing that we are on the road to protecting parents who are becoming parents through IVF, becoming parents through, egg, sperm, embryo donation, and surrogacy. So there's a lot of new good laws. Mm-hmm. We're sitting here in New York. New York is one of those places where there, recently was a change in the law in 2021. We had a surrogacy ban in New York, and it was overturned after many, many, many decades of people working really hard to get it overturned. There's also been a lot of bad law made, as we're all thinking about as the election is coming up, and particularly with embryo personhood laws, abortion laws, which do affect things like surrogacy. And, there's been a political focus on IVF for, which is both good and bad. I mean, it's good that we're kind of talking about it as a political issue for maybe the first time, which is really important, especially because it's becoming more and more common.
Yep.
But of course, there are states where if you do IVF and you have leftover embryos, you're in a bit of a pickle.
Yeah, I mean, I know Alabama is one of those. And there's a wrongful death action for these 3 parents whose embryos were destroyed, which I think leads to a lot of legal questions. Like, if you are to dispose of embryos, are you liable for murder? Which sounds crazy to talk about to us, but I know that is an open question, and I don't think that case has been resolved as of yet.
Right. I mean, right. It's an open question, both from the legal perspective, from like a political perspective, how we talk about this. I mean, obviously, I don't agree, with the result in the Alabama decision. Unfortunately, questions of embryo disposition are harder for couples and for individuals going through reproductive technology in red states. The Alabama case it's tough to understand how they will implement those consequences to individuals.
Yeah.
But Alabama's not the only state with law like that. Louisiana also says that embryos are judicial persons.
Yes.
And can sue, which happened in the case with Sofia Vergara. Her ex-boyfriend sued for the ability, their embryos sued for the ability to, not be destroyed, essentially. It complicates things. I mean, it really complicates how we think about the options that people have for embryo disposition. In those states, you have a situation where, people just kind of might be in limbo, paying for their storage fees forever. I don't work in those states. I'm not licensed in states with embryo personhood laws. So it's hard to know how it actually, in daily life, how it would, if people would actually be stopped from shipping their embryos somewhere else to destroy them if they wanted to, or, what the actual consequences on the ground might be.
It's just fascinating. I know in New York, which is where you're licensed and where we're sitting today, New York statute is very clear that embryos are property. Is that correct?
New York case law has sort of taken the approach, a contractual approach to embryo disposition, which is that, if you have a form from your clinic that says that you've chosen to destroy the embryos, or you've chosen to donate them for medical research or something like that, New York tends to uphold those prior decisions. But it's not. I would say that it's not necessarily hard and fast that this law is evolving, particularly in the case of divorce. Yep. There are many different approaches that blue states take to deciding issues of embryo disposition, particularly when a case comes in front of the court. The individual circumstances of the people who are getting divorced are often taken into account. There's all kinds of, approaches that states might take. I'm also licensed in New Jersey and Colorado. Those are also blue states. And there have been cases in those states that, have taken a different approach. So it's really evolving. It's new, which is why I encourage clients to always have these conversations before they're getting married, after they're getting married, if they're thinking of doing like a marital agreement or a postnuptial agreement, because it can really save people heartache and time and money if they have to deal with this eventually.
And according to the CDC, 2.3% of all births are due to ART, assisted reproductive technologies. So how can couples think about this in the context of a prenup? I know we love to talk about prenups.
Well, I always think about it in terms of two categories, right? There's people who you're talking to who have already gone through IVF, who already have embryos frozen, who might be interested in getting a prenup done. That might be the main reason that they're interested in getting a prenup done, is to avoid, emotional and expensive litigation if they get divorced about their embryos. The other group of people are people who don't know if they're going to need IVF, don't know what their lives might bring, and might be interested in including clauses about embryo disposition in a prenup even before they've gone through IVF. And that may seem a little crazy to people, like how can we contract about something we don't even know about? But that's actually what prenups are. I mean, you don't know if you're going to get divorced. You don't know, if you're going to be in a situation where one person is earning a lot more than the other and someone's going to need alimony. So it's all a bit of guesswork. And the whole point of a prenup is to lay out what all the different versions of your reality that could possibly happen and planning for them. And I always like to talk to clients about how much better it is to make decisions about embryos, about property distribution, about, spousal support, whatever it might be, when everyone still loves each other. It's absolutely worse to do that when you're in the middle of, hating each other.
And these are really tough conversations. I mean, prenups by themselves are hard enough to talk about. So,
especially when one person wants it and the other person doesn't.
Exactly. I mean, how should couples approach the topic of reproductive technology in a prenup? Because it's just layer upon layer.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think bringing it up at all is a good start. Like, even talking about it is a good start, because I think a lot of people don't realize that you can include clauses about
many divorce attorneys don't realize that.
That is true. And and it's still an evolving area, right? A lot of attorneys have different thoughts about what you can include in a prenup. States have different statutes about it. So it's not the same everywhere. And it's really important for people to talk to a lawyer in their state. Absolutely. But it's true that a lot of attorneys don't realize that it's an option. And in states where it is a common practice, I think that even if clients don't end up wanting to include clauses about embryos or any other frozen genetic material in a prenup, still talking to them about it before talking to whoever your client is before that, so they know it's an option, just gets them thinking about it. Even if they don't include it in their prenup, it's just important that they know that it's a thing that they could eventually include if they want to amend their prenup, if they feel weird about it now. Let's say they do IVF 10 years down the line, they could always include it. So I just think more knowledge is power.
Should attorneys be thinking about the client's age or health history when they're having these conversations?
Oftentimes an attorney might not be in the position to know about a client's health history, when they've been retained for a prenup. I think, age is an interesting question. I wonder how it plays out regionally. I live in New York City. People get married later here. People People have kids later here.
Yeah.
I laugh because I'm 35. I'm almost 6 months pregnant. This is my first child, and I am like sort of towards the beginning or dead center, especially of my friends who went to law school, of people who are having kids.
Yeah.
And that's really different than many other areas in the country. And so are we thinking about it more here? Probably. The other thing is that, in my world, I live in a world where lots of my friends, their companies pay for them to freeze their eggs.
Yep.
It's just on people's mind a lot more than it used to be, and then than it might be in other states or, in other places. So I think that it is important for everyone to think about, but especially, I do think if you're an attorney and you're representing someone who, might be getting married, in their 40s or something like that, it's probably more important to have that conversation for sure.
What are some of the key challenges that people experience when building a family using assisted reproductive technologies?
Well, there are quite a few. I would say first is, of course, emotional, psychological. It's very tough, and you can go through many, many rounds. There are many different people who are using art to create their families, right? You have heterosexual couples who are experiencing infertility. You have same-sex couples who have always known that they would need to use art to build their families, but it doesn't necessarily make it any easier just because the expectation has been there.
Right.
It's a long process. You need to find doctors. You need to find a clinic. You need to save up. And that's the other aspect to it. Is financially, it is very expensive in this country. We don't do a good job in this country of helping people have kids through IVF from a financial perspective. It's a pain to get some of these IVF cycles covered by your health insurance. And if you add in surrogacy on top of that, I mean, it's really, really it is incredibly expensive. So I think sort of emotionally, it's an emotionally challenging process. It's a financially challenging process. And it just often takes a lot longer than people want it to take. And especially with heterosexual couples going through IVF and possibly surrogacy or an egg donation or a sperm donation, they're already at the end of the rope. They've tried lots of things. Yep. And that usually means lots of things have not worked. And so it can be a painful process. But that also means that there's a lot of joy at the end, if it does result in a baby.
One of the reasons that we wanted to include embryo clauses in HelloPrenup's agreements was because there was this confusion around what happens at the clinic, right? And we saw this play out in a really unfortunate way in the Arizona case, Torres v. Terrell, where Ruby Torres went through cancer treatments, and the couple had frozen embryos shortly before getting married. A couple years later, they get divorced. She wants to keep the embryos because she always wanted to be a mom. Her now ex-husband does not. And, after the appeal, the court ruled to donate the embryos. Now, if you read the case, there's a point at which, well, actually, I don't know that's true. Now, I'm sure Ruby didn't anticipate that this would be the outcome when she signed those clinic forms, right? And I hear this from a lot of my friends. They go into a clinic and they've gone through this process and they just sign on the dotted line. They flip through things really quickly, barely think about what that means for the future. And understandably so. It's a high-pressure situation. So How do prenups help resolve the issue of that kind of just sign on the dotted line at the clinic?
Yeah. I ask all my friends who have gone in to freeze their eggs, freeze embryos, whatever they might have done, did you sign clinic forms?
Yeah.
And most people say yes. And I say, do you remember what you signed? And most people don't.
Right.
Or they remember something different than their partner remembers. You are not in a state of mind where you're thinking, oh, I'm sitting in the doctor's office. I haven't had enough coffee. Maybe I was 15 minutes late to this appointment. I have things going on at work. Like you're not sitting there thinking, oh, what I'm filling out could have legal consequences if I get divorced.
Right.
It's a tough question because what is the clinic supposed to do? Are they supposed to say, oh, you need to have an attorney with you when you fill out these clinic forms? Like, no, that's not realistic. We don't sit at doctor's offices with attorneys and fill out medical forms. And even, of course, on the forms, I've seen many of these forms say, if you have any questions, please consult with an attorney before you fill this out or whatever.
But New York requires an attorney in order for a valid embryo disposition agreement, correct?
An embryo disposition agreement is not a clinic form. An embryo disposition agreement is like a prenup for embryos. So, yes, in New York, as part of the rehaul of it's embedded in the revamp of the surrogacy law, but we do have a statute about embryo disposition agreements. But that is if a couple has decided to do an agreement about about what happens to their embryos. That means that they're already at a stage where they're thinking about this in the way that we want everyone to be thinking about it. Right. But at the stage of filling something out at the clinic, New York doesn't have any requirements about that from like whether people need to be represented by an attorney at that time. Sure. And I think that there is a lot of confusion about how impactful those decisions that you make when you're sitting there might be.
Especially without any legal advice. I mean, you're sitting there signing away your rights to your future embryos, potentially.
Exactly.
And you have not spoken to an attorney.
Exactly.
Sometimes you don't know what you're signing.
You might not even have spoken to your spouse about it ever before.
Right.
You might be like in a crowded waiting room talking to them about it for the first time, or one of you is just trying to fill it out really quickly so you can get to the appointment, and the other one doesn't even know what you filled out. Yep. So, I mean, it's definitely, it's an area where I think medical practices, fertility practices, and attorneys need to work together more. And we just need to, do a better job of opening up the conversation so that patients who are going through IVF know that what they could be signing in those waiting rooms are very important. And of course, but the other complicating factor is that each state has different case law that handles those clinic forms differently. Right. There's a recent case out of Maryland, a couple of cases, I believe, that said that the clinic forms are unenforceable when it comes to embryo disposition because the forms are boilerplate. And basically, you can't decide something that important based on a boilerplate form that has the fertility clinic's interests at heart and not the interests of the people signing it. So, I mean, it's confusing.
So what do those couples do?
Right. I mean, so in those cases, those were brought because those were people were divorcing. And so, that in those situations, there's, of course, a weighing of the different factors and the situation that's presented by the couple, which person wants to have a child, which person does not. And then you have this legally complicated question of, is somebody's right to have a child more important than somebody's right not to have a child?
And this is where it gets really complex, because this kind of harkens back to what we were talking about in Arizona.
Yeah.
Torres v. Terrell. And the court decided that husband's right not to be a parent outweighed wife's right, or wife's want to be a parent.
Right. It's really complicated. There's not a clear legal answer to it at all.
So what happens in the case where a couple already has a prenup? They did not include this in their prenup. They get married. Now they're going through the ART process, and they need some type of agreement. Where do they go? What do they do?
Well, if they're in New York, they can do an embryo disposition agreement without changing their prenup. Basically these agreements are probably you can do a version of these agreements in states that also don't specifically say you can. Yeah. If everything, like both parties are represented by counsel, they're written down, they're notarized, whatever the requirements might be. So you can always do an embryo disposition agreement in states that say that embryos are not people. I don't know, frankly, what a state like Louisiana or Alabama would have to say if people tried to do an embryo disposition agreement there, and they tried to contract about the fate of embryos. That sort of makes my head want to blow up. Like I don't know. I would imagine if that went in
criminal liability.
Right.
Yeah.
I imagine if that went in front of a court, that would be an incredibly interesting case. But also, it's very complicated for states that have law like that. But in other states, you can always do those agreements, and then you can also always amend your prenup if everyone agrees. That's the catch. Clients always ask me that. Can I amend this if we decide we want to put this in later? And it's like, of course you can. You just have to make sure to do it at a time when everyone's still getting along. It's really tough to amend a prenup if the relationship has gone sour, and that's why you're amending the prenup, because you know that you're eventually going to have to use it.
Would you recommend that couples who are getting a postnup, a lot of couples getting postnups, they're doing so because either their parents are requiring them to do so for inheritance purposes, and they didn't get a prenup for whatever reason, would you recommend that they put an embryo disposition clause in a postnup?
Yeah. If that's what they're doing, if that's the avenue that's available to them, absolutely. There's no reason not to. I think that it's a great tool to use, especially if you're already doing it for whatever reason, for an inheritance reason, or, because your parents told you need to. I would say that it is a great way to make sure that you don't have to leave the fate of your embryos up to a judge, or you don't have to deal with it in one of the most stressful times of your life.
Do you have any concerns for the future of IVF in this political climate?
Yes, but I'm less concerned about the future of IVF than I am about the future of abortion. And I think that IVF is this category where people seem to be a little bit more flexible, because I think it's because there's less shame about talking about going through IVF than having had an abortion. So people seem to have more personal contact with other people who've gone through IVF. Yeah. And because it's helping people have children as opposed to helping people not have children. So I think that makes me very nervous. You know, what a a conservative, when we already have a conservative Supreme Court, but what conservative state courts might do to restrict IVF, and not necessarily restrict IVF itself, but just restrict the destruction of embryos. That is very scary. But I think of all of the things facing this country right now, IVF is not the thing I'm most worried about.
And I think what it often comes down to, especially in red states, is controlling women's bodies, right?
Yeah.
And when we're talking about IVF, my hope is that because IVF is something that is more regularly available to those who have more money, who are higher educated and access to resources, perhaps that means it will be more supported, right? Because a lot of those with political clout are those who are wealthier, are those who may be the grandparents of grandchildren who were born via IVF. So my hope is that it will not be the optionality around IVF won't be interrupted in red states by political implications. But, I'm not, given what's happened with Dobbs, I'm not exactly hopeful.
Yeah. I mean, I think the unfortunate reality in this country is that anything to do with reproductive law, whether it's terminating a pregnancy, whether it's IVF, if you have the means to travel to do what you want, you'll be able to.
It's
the
sad.
problem, and
sad.
it really shouldn't be such an unequal thing, because infertility affects everyone.
Yeah,
and there are real implications in this country for people who are not able to afford. There are real implications for the fact that reproductive technology is just less accessible to people who don't have the money to pay for it. And it's not how other countries deal with reproductive technology.
Yeah.
We've really made it an expensive endeavor when it's not necessarily the case in other places. And it's funny for a country that leans pretty religious, that really wants people to have children and to have families. It's funny to put up so many financial, legal, and insurance obstacles to growing their family through reproductive technology. And I mean, I do think the one good thing that has come out of IVF being in the political spotlight has been that you get some conservative politicians saying that they've used IVF in their own families, right? So we had Mitt Romney say that. I think it's a lot easier, like what I was saying before, it's a lot easier to say, we've used IVF in our family, if you're a conservative politician, than to say, oh yeah, people in our family have had abortions, right? That's a lot easier. And of course, maybe that's not even happened. But I think that, it's good for people to see how widespread infertility is and the use of reproductive technologies. And it's not just IVF. Tim Walz, they used IUI. And I think, it's good to be educating people on the different options, and the fact that it's a really common thing.
Yeah, it is common. It's more and more common as the years go on. I mean, I'm in my mid-30s, and a lot of my friends, like I said, have used this, and it feels like it's part of our conversation. It's part of public discourse, and it's becoming more and more normalized, which I think is great. And I hope we continue to go that way and educate people and feel empowered by it versus shamed by it.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about surrogacy in New York. I know there's been a lot of recent case law, and I'm sure everyone listening is curious.
Well, surrogacy, I don't know. There's been recent sort of statute overhauls in New York. So we had a pretty an almost total ban on compensated surrogacy in New York. Of course, there people got around it in different ways, whatever. But that was the case. That was the law here for a long time, since the 90s. And there was this case in 1988, 1989 called Baby M, which was that sort of gave surrogacy a bad reputation back in the day. It was what we call genetic or traditional surrogacy, where the surrogate's egg was used. Of course, the technology was completely different back then.
What year was this?
1989. So that case made headlines. It really freaked people out about surrogacy because there was a conflict over parental rights, and the surrogate kind of went back and forth about wanting to give up parental rights or not, and it was this whole protracted legal battle and horrible process. And what came out of that was a wave of legislation, not started like in New York and New Jersey where the case happened, but then it was a wave throughout the country of laws that restricted or fully banned surrogacy. So the law in Michigan that just got overturned was part of that. And so we had laws like that in New York and New Jersey on the books for 20 to 30 years. And it didn't match up with the political reality in those states. And it didn't match up with the fact that there were a lot of same-sex male couples living in New York, living in New Jersey, trying to become parents in those states. And especially after legalization of same-sex marriage in this country, it really did not feel that it matched up with what the law should be in these states. And this was before, the people who the advocates, the legislators, the attorneys who worked on this law, they worked on it for years and years. And this is before my time in this field. And so, I absolutely cannot take credit for the incredible work that was done to change it. The surrogacy law that we have in New York is very thorough. It's a long statute. It is and it's working. It's we're in our third year of it. There are certainly some kinks that we have to work out, like any new law. There are some residency requirements that are sometimes tough to implement, tough to work through. I would say, another aspect that sometimes it's complicated is just educating the court system about what surrogacy is and what we have to do in order to, make sure that intended parents have parental rights as opposed to a surrogate and her spouse if she has one. So, these are all pieces of the law changing. It, of course, takes much longer than you expect it to. But, it's definitely, the law in New York is it's a great thing. It's been used as a model of a surrogacy, for surrogacy laws in other states that are creating laws or updating their laws. And, in the time, in the past 5-10 years, you've had many, many states implement surrogacy statutes. New Jersey's was in 2018. New Jersey had the same ban that New York did. Colorado, where I'm also licensed, didn't have any law about surrogacy at all, and so it was practiced very, very protectively for years in Colorado without a statute. But now we have a statute in Colorado that is great and working well and really just reflects the practices that were done before there was a statute. So there are many different ways to be a surrogacy-friendly state. In New York, we love regulation, so that's how we do it here. And in some other states, there are different ways, but it's I would say it's going well.
What would you recommend couples think about if they're thinking about including an embryo clause in their prenup? How do they decide what to do?
What to do in terms of
how do they
decide
what
their options are?
Yeah, how do they decide what to contract to? I mean, theoretically, you're sitting there with your future spouse and you're talking about all of these things that haven't happened yet, right? You don't know if you're going to have reproductive trouble.
Right.
And it feels, from what I've heard, is that it feels really premature to talk about this, but it also feels like the responsible thing to do. And so how do you decide so far in advance what you might want to do in the future? What should people be thinking about during that conversation?
Yeah. I mean, I think, first of all, the expectation from any attorney talking to a client should just be that their clients talk to each other about it. Not necessarily that it gets included in the agreement. I think the win is that people are talking about it.
Agreed. Yep.
And I think it's really important for attorneys who are creating prenups and postnups to understand what the world of options are.
Yeah.
And probably a lot of people don't, because this is this is such a niche area. The options are destroy or discard the embryos. Some people want to do a system that is a little complicated, where if there are more than one embryo left over that's frozen, they want to split up those embryos and, each take an equal amount. Or, of course, one person takes one more if there's an odd number. That, of course, has a lot of legal implications for parental rights and what might happen if people decide to actually use the embryos to have children. So, I would say that that's pretty uncommon that people actually want to do that. But again, it's important to know what all the options are. Yep. The other option is one spouse takes all the embryos. Mm-hmm. You can also donate the embryos to research, particularly if the clinic or storage facility that the embryos are stored at have a program for that.
Yep.
You can also donate the embryos to a matching agency.
Is that snowflake adoption?
There are many different ways to do it.
Yeah.
There certainly are programs that people can call and say, we have 3 embryos, we want to donate them. Yeah. You can also donate to someone specific. You can say, there might be someone in your life who is going to need to use reproductive technology. You might want them to have the option of using any leftover embryos. And you can say something like, basically, if we get divorced, we want to give this person the option of using these embryos. And if they don't want it, then we're going to destroy them, or then we're going to donate to medical research. So it doesn't just have to be one option. Sure. So there are lots of options, but it's still, of course, a limited world.
Yeah. It's really interesting to hear about all of those options, and I'm sure that each one of those prompts an additional conversation. And it's so important for couples to have these conversations before getting married. It's important for them to talk about finances. It's important for them to talk about life goals. And I think it's equally as important for them to talk about reproductive
absolutely
plans. Is there anything else you would like people to know about art or any of these processes?
I think for me, the most important thing for people to know is that all different kinds of people are having children through all different kinds of ways. And I've worked on agreements with all different types of people looking for all different types of arrangements. And there's no shame in any of this. And there's also really nothing. I think some people think that to involve attorneys in building a family has a bit of an ick factor. Like, I don't want to talk to an attorney about this, and I definitely don't want to have to retain an attorney and then have to feel like my sister who's donating an egg to me is an opposing party because she also has to have an attorney for the egg donation agreement. And I can understand why that might feel not great, a little like too contentious for what it is. This is not a contentious field of law. This is collaborative. This is making sure that everybody understands what the consequences of these agreements are.
Right.
And the point of these agreements and prenups and anything that deals with what you might do with genetic material in order to have a kid, the point of all of it is hopefully so that you do it, you sign it, and you never have to look at it again.
You put it in the drawer.
Exactly.
And I just want to say that if couples who are getting a prenup through HelloPrenup in New York or Colorado or New Jersey want to hire you as their attorney, they're able to do that. So you can be hired through HelloPrenup as one of the representing attorneys, and you can make modifications to that prenup and that embryo clause to meet their requirements or interests. Or
absolutely. I mean, we've through HelloPrenup have the embryo clauses have been rolled out recently, and from what I understand, it's going great. I've worked with a few couples at this point who have used them, some of whom already have embryos and some of whom don't. And we're really curious about what it meant to include in a prenup, and seemed really happy about the option to be able to do so. So I think that I think that building a platform like HelloPrenup where you're making prenups more accessible to people, right? Because the whole point is that it's a more financially accessible way to do a prenup, which is really important. And it's also a way to enable people to be more educated about the things that could be decided in a divorce. And nobody wants to think about that before they get married. But, I think that there is hopefully a side of creating a prenup with a spouse that brings you closer.
Yep.
You have to go through this disclosure of your finances. I didn't talk to my husband about how much money was in his retirement account literally ever. Why would I talk about that?
Yeah.
People, if you feel like you know everything about somebody, there's still probably lots of things that you don't know about because you don't need to.
Yeah.
Until you do this process. And so I think including conversations about reproductive technology as part of that is a great way to start making the whole issue of reproductive technology more accessible to everyone.
Thank you, Rachel, so much for being here with me today.
Thank
this
you.
was so much fun.
Thank you so much.
I know I learned a lot.